explosives ordnance disposal. Specialist Valeria Corres had been attached to SEAL Team 7 for 6 months. She'd never witnessed them hesitate like this. The kill zone stretched 200 meters ahead, an open field scattered with IEDs, anti-personnel mines, and concealed traps that had already destroyed 3 vehicles along with a recon unit. Corres, find us an alternate route, Lieutenant Commander Dravorn instructed, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. That field is a graveyard. Valeria lifted her binoculars, scanning the jagged fragments of twisted metal where mines had already exploded. Beyond that deadly stretch stood a village, civilians trapped under enemy control. The SEALs were right. Entering that field was suicide, but sometimes walking into death was the only path to saving lives. The Afghan morning sun carved long shadows across the Helmand. Province Valley as SEAL Team 7 established overwatch from a rugged ridge, overlooking what intelligence marked as target Area Bravo. The once fertile valley floor, abandoned by farmers, had been systematically turned over the last 3 months into a lethal defensive network, an evolution of Taliban warfare. Staff Sergeant Valeria Corres steadied herself behind the spotting scope, carefully analyzing ground she had obsessed over for the past 24 hours. Just 3 days earlier, an aid convoy had been ambushed while passing through this same valley. Survivors, 4 doctors and 2 nurses with Doctors Without Borders, were now prisoners. Inside the fortified compound of Kala Inal, a cluster of mud brick structures 200 meters beyond the minefield. On paper, the rescue should have been straightforward for SEAL Team 7. The intelligence report described moderate resistance, a fixed objective, and high-value civilian hostages whose recovery justified extreme risks. But what changed everything was the minefield, a barrier that had already destroyed 3 armored vehicles and claimed the lives of 8 Afghan National Army scouts. The intelligence briefing outlined chilling details about its design. Unlike the crude improvised defenses of the past, this minefield had been engineered with military-grade explosives, advanced trigger systems, and precise layouts suggesting professional training and years of combat experience. Drone surveillance had even caught glimpses of the build, Taliban engineers measuring distances with accuracy, conducting live test detonations to calculate blast patterns, and concealing devices with expert camouflage that made them nearly invisible, even against modern detection equipment. Corres, give me your professional assessment of that obstacle, Dravorn demanded. Lieutenant Commander Dravorn asked, lowering himself beside her with tactical maps spread across the rocky surface. Valeria had been attached to special operations units for the past 18 months, after 4 earlier deployments with conventional forces where her tasks were mostly limited to clearing routes and securing buildings. Once combat units had already taken control, her assignment with SEAL Team 7 had thrust her into a different kind of fight. Missions in contested ground where EOD specialists worked under direct fire, relying on partial intelligence against threats, deliberately engineered to defeat their expertise. Her background included training at the Navy's EOD school, the Army's disposal center, and advanced classified courses on neutralizing complex IED systems. Yet classroom lessons often fell short against the adaptive creativity of insurgent bomb makers, who blended academic engineering with years of practical battlefield experience. Sir, this is the most advanced minefield I've seen, Corres answered, keeping her eyes pressed to the high-powered optics. They've layered different threats, pressure mines, command-detonated IEDs, and hidden booby traps arranged to overlap and form interlocking kill zones. The field embodied everything she feared about insurgent ingenuity. Early in her career, makeshift bombs had been crude devices, assembled from scrap by men with minimal technical knowledge. Years of warfare, however, had shaped a generation of Taliban engineers who paired military-grade training with decades of asymmetric combat, evolving their craft into something terrifyingly precise. Dravorn raised his own binoculars, studying the ground. He spotted faint signs that betrayed the buried explosives, soil, disturbed in unnatural patterns, vegetation spaced in ways that didn't follow natural growth, and small earthen ridges concealing anti-personnel mines, built to cripple rather than kill outright. The sophistication of the minefield was clear in the way it exploited the valley's features. Depressions masked explosives from aerial detection, while channeling attackers into narrow kill zones, jagged rock outcroppings that might have served as cover instead, disguised enemy lookout points from which Taliban spotters could trigger remote detonations. Explain their tactical design, Dravorn pressed. Valeria had spent years training herself to think like the bomb makers she fought, learning not just the mechanics of their devices, but the strategy behind their placement. Sir, this minefield isn't only physical, it's psychological, she began, It funnels any rescue attempt into pre-calculated kill zones while simultaneously crushing the confidence of anyone trying to cross. The psychological element mattered as much as the explosives themselves. Taliban engineers understood that the strongest defenses didn't just kill, they stopped attacks before they even began. A minefield that looked impossible to breach could delay or cancel rescue attempts entirely, achieving the enemy's objective without firing a shot. They understand that American doctrine in hostage rescues depends on speed and precision, Valeria explained. This minefield leaves us two options: either accept massive casualties, trying to breach it directly, or abandon the hostages while chasing alternatives that probably don't exist. Trevorn glanced at his watch, checking it against the intelligence timeline. The captives had been taken 72 hours earlier, and reports indicated they would be executed at sunset if no rescue attempt succeeded. That gave SEAL Team 7 just 6 hours to solve a problem that, under normal military engineering standards, would take several days. The deadline wasn't random. Intercepted communications revealed Taliban leaders intended to turn the executions into propaganda, broadcasting them as proof that American special operations could be defeated. The psychological fallout would go far beyond the loss of 6 lives, strengthening Taliban recruitment and eroding U.S. public support. How long with standard clearance procedures? Trevorn asked. Corres quickly ran the numbers in her head, estimating how long it would take to methodically detect and disable each device. The math was grim. Sir, cutting even a single lane would take 12 to 16 hours. Under perfect conditions, she replied. That's with ideal weather, no enemy interference, and specialized equipment we don't have. It was clear conventional methods weren't possible within the window. Even if they had the luxury of time, the task would require heavy engineering assets, additional disposal teams, and procedures that would broadcast their presence to every Taliban observer in the valley. By design, standard clearance was deliberate. Each suspected device had to be approached slowly, confirmed and then neutralized with maximum caution. The method saved EOD lives, but it was utterly unsuited for a time-critical hostage rescue. Valeria had joined the Navy 6 years earlier after earning an engineering degree at the University of Texas. She had chosen explosive ordnance disposal because it matched her technical background while directly protecting soldiers in combat. But her first deployment had already taught her a hard truth. Real battlefields were nothing like the controlled classrooms where she learned her trade. Out here, EOD specialists worked under fire, racing against the clock, facing traps designed by clever, ruthless bomb makers who built every device to exploit their training and kill them anyway. Every deployment had deepened her grasp of insurgent strategies and improved her ability to tackle EOD challenges that overwhelmed specialists dependent only on classroom training and routine protocols. Within the Special Operations Circle, her standing was built on resolving explosive ordnance threats that had baffled others. She had cultivated an almost instinctive sense of how enemy bomb makers thought, which enabled her to notice patterns and anticipate device placement with a precision that felt uncanny to peers who couldn't see the reasoning process she applied. Sir, there could be an unconventional way to address this situation, Valeria said, examining the minefield through interpretive models she had refined over years of facing insurgent engineering. Clarify. The field is arranged according to assumptions about how U.S. troops would attempt to cross defended ground. Those assumptions generate recognizable patterns in threat distribution, and those patterns can be studied and turned to advantage. Trevorn had enough combat history to realize that desperate circumstances often called for creative tactics, yet he also knew that unusual methods carried dangers that could lead to devastating mistakes if misapplied. Corres, I need clear details. What specific alternative are you putting forward? Valeria indicated zones of the minefield that looked most strongly fortified. Sir, they've focused their deadliest traps on routes offering natural cover, favorable observation points, and logical pathways for attackers. Standard defensive design? Correct, sir. But they've also shaped sections that look extremely hazardous to mislead, deliberately steering us away from corridors that could actually be safer than they appear. Trevorn assessed the ground again, working to follow the counterintuitive reasoning Valeria was outlining. Military schooling stressed choosing terrain features that shielded advancing forces and gave tactical benefits, not deliberately selecting approaches that looked most exposed to enemy fire. The idea undercut basic principles of movement, drilled into every operator of SEAL Team 7 through years of preparation and combat. U.S. doctrine, was rooted in exploiting terrain for protection, limiting vulnerability, and holding initiative through strong positioning and maneuver. You're implying that the sectors that look the most perilous may actually hold fewer explosives, correct? I'm saying insurgent. Bomb builders are bound by the same material limits that shape all combat engineering. They cannot distribute endless devices across every meter of a 200-meter stretch. They are forced to prioritize where to deploy their most lethal weapons. Valeria's assessment rested on her grasp of the real-world limits that shaped insurgent engineering. Even the most skilled bomb makers had to operate within boundaries of resources, time, and technical skill. Those limits produced recognizable patterns in how defensive barriers were built, and patterns could be identified by someone with enough background and analytical ability. Corres, are you offering to validate this theory by leading a passage through that minefield? Valeria looked at the barrier, then at the settlement beyond, where civilians were about to be executed. Because a unit of elite fighters had been stopped by a tactical puzzle they couldn't solve with standard methods. The choice in front of her embodied everything she had absorbed in 6 years of explosive ordnance, disposal schooling, and 4 combat tours in some of the world's harshest battlegrounds. The weight of the moment extended beyond her own survival. If her evaluation was wrong, she would be dead within her first few steps. If her judgment was right but her execution faltered, the result would be no different. If she crossed successfully but her path couldn't be repeated safely by the SEAL team, the hostages would still perish and her risk would mean nothing. Yet Valeria knew that certain crises could only be solved by someone ready to accept risks that seemed irrational to those without. The specialized insight to recognize when an apparent suicide mission was, in fact, the least dangerous path available. Sir, I'm volunteering to prove that sometimes the path that looks deadliest is actually the one chance of survival. Drevorn gathered SEAL Team 7 for a tactical briefing to evaluate whether Valeria's unorthodox reasoning could be shaped into a workable plan. For crossing terrain that traditional doctrine declared uncrossable, Chief Petty Officer Victor Kane, the team's senior enlisted member, reviewed Valeria's suggested route with the skepticism born of 2 decades in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Corres, you're suggesting we walk across a minefield, deliberately engineered to kill American special operators. Kane said, that's a textbook suicide mission. Chief, I'm talking about moving across it with knowledge of why these devices were positioned, where they are, and why certain corridors were left, less fortified than others. Petty Officer First Class Ethan Varga, the team's point man, scanned the terrain through high-powered optics. His years of urban combat across multiple wars had taught him to see the patterns in how insurgents set traps for U.S. troops. Ma'am, this field looks like someone condensed 2 decades of combat lessons into the ultimate ambush for Americans. That's exactly why it might work, Valeria answered. Ultimate traps follow ultimate patterns, and once you see the pattern, you can spot the exceptions. Petty Officer Second Class Adrian Holt, the team's intelligence specialist, had been tracking enemy transmissions and evaluating signals. Intelligence throughout their surveillance of the target zone. Ma'am, intercepts confirm Taliban elements have set up multiple lookout posts covering this field, Holt reported. Even if you chart a viable path, they'll see your movement and could trigger command-detonated charges. Valeria had already factored this threat into her study of the minefield's defenses. Command-detonated munitions were among the most dangerous hurdles for forces attempting to breach fortified ground. Yet they also carried weaknesses that could be turned to advantage by someone who understood the technical and psychological limits shaping their use. Holt, that's actually something we can exploit, Valeria said. Command-detonated weapons work best when operators can anticipate how we'll move. If we advance through areas they don't expect, their ability to use those systems effectively is drastically reduced. The tactical dialogue continued as Valeria outlined her breakdown of the minefield structure and the logic behind its layout. She explained how Taliban engineers had designed a killing zone based on their reading of American maneuver doctrine, but in doing so had created predictable sequences through the very complexity that made the barrier seem impossible to breach. Her assessment also drew on intelligence about the particular insurgent cell that had emplaced the mines. This group had built similar defenses elsewhere, giving Valeria insight not just into their technical process but also into their tactical tendencies and psychological habits when designing obstacles. Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Cross, the team's medic, had worked with Valeria on prior missions and was familiar with her unconventional methods and analytical depth. Valeria, I've watched you solve EOD challenges that others couldn't touch, Cross said. But this isn't a single device, it's 200 meters where every step could kill you instantly. Ryan, that's precisely why it can be managed, Valeria answered. They can't make every step lethal. Resources aren't unlimited. Constraints force patterns, and patterns can be exploited. Trevorn then made the call that would either confirm Valeria's expertise or end in losses, severe enough to destroy both her and his career. Corres, you're cleared to attempt reconnaissance on your route. If you prove it safe, the rest of us will move behind you. Valeria conducted final equipment checks, selecting tools and protective gear based on her analysis of threats she would encounter during the crossing. Her equipment load represented careful balance between protection and mobility. Understanding that survival would depend more on avoiding detection than surviving it, she chose minimal electronic equipment, relying primarily on visual recognition of explosive device indicators, rather than metal detectors that might broadcast her location to enemy forces. Monitoring radio frequencies, her primary tools were trained observation, skills and understanding of insurgent engineering practices, developed through years of experience. Valeria approached the minefield, edge with methodical precision that had characterized her. 6 years of EOD experience. Each step was calculated based on analysis of terrain features, vegetation patterns, and subtle indicators revealing where explosive devices had been buried. Her movement technique combined conventional mind detection procedures with intuitive analysis of how insurgent bomb makers approached the problem of killing American soldiers. She identified pressure plates by studying vegetation disturbance during device placement. She located command, detonated explosives by tracing wire patterns connecting buried charges to concealed firing positions. The first 75 men confirmed her analysis. Areas appearing most dangerous. Open ground offering no tactical advantages, contained fewer explosive devices because Taliban engineers assumed no trained personnel would approach through terrain providing no protection. Valeria navigated using understanding that the obstacles designers had created a tactical puzzle based on assumptions about how enemies would behave when confronted with apparently insurmountable challenges. At the crossing's midpoint, Valeria encountered the most sophisticated, explosive device cluster she had ever seen. Anti-personnel mines arranged in patterns that would funnel anyone detecting the first devices directly into kill radius of secondary charges, positioned to exploit evasive maneuvers that conventional EOD procedures would dictate. The configuration represented culmination of insurgent learning about defeating American military capabilities. It specifically targeted training, equipment, and tactical procedures that EOD specialists used when navigating dangerous terrain. But Valeria had spent years learning how such sophisticated traps could be defeated. She identified the narrow corridor existing between overlapping blast zones, marked it for the SEAL team, and continued her advance toward the objective. As Valeria approached the final section, she encountered the ultimate deception. Taliban engineers had incorporated into their design what appeared to be clear passage, an obvious route seeming to offer safety. After successfully navigating most of the obstacle, was actually the most densely mined area of the entire field. This final trap was designed to kill anyone who had successfully crossed most of the minefield and might believe they had solved the tactical puzzle. It exploited the psychological tendency of people under extreme stress to assume identified patterns would continue when the most dangerous portion had been saved for last. Valeria navigated around the deception using terrain features, providing concealment from enemy observers, while avoiding kill zones, established to destroy anyone successfully crossing the majority of the field. Corres to Team 7, she radioed after 90 minutes of careful movement. I have reached the objective side. Route is marked and confirmed safe. Within 25 minutes, SEAL Team 7 had crossed the minefield using Valeria's markers. Not a single explosive device detonated. No team members were injured. The hostage rescue operation was executed with textbook precision. All 6 civilian aid workers were recovered safely. Taliban forces were neutralized with no American casualties. The mission's success depended entirely on Valeria's willingness to take the first step into terrain conventional analysis had declared impassable. 2 days later, Lieutenant Commander Trevorn submitted recommendations for Valeria to receive the Bronze Star with Valor for actions enabling successful completion of the critical rescue mission. Corres, what you accomplished was either brilliant tactical innovation or the luckiest decision in military history, Chief Victor Kane said during the return flight. Chief, Preparation meeting opportunity creates what people call luck, Valeria replied. 3 weeks later, Valeria received orders to report to the Joint IED Defeat Organization at Fort Belvoir, where she would develop training programs based on her analysis of advanced insurgent minefield tactics. Her techniques for identifying safe routes through apparently impassable terrain would be incorporated into EOD curricula and special operations doctrine throughout the military. Methods she developed would prepare specialists for operations where conventional clearance procedures were inadequate. Valeria's approach, known as the Corres Method among EOD specialists, required understanding not just technical aspects of explosive devices, but psychological and tactical thinking guiding their employment by insurgent forces. The method emphasized analyzing human motivations behind obstacle construction than relying solely on technical procedures and electronic equipment. It demanded psychological insight combined with technical expertise, analytical thinking balanced with personal courage. Years later, Valeria received reports from EOD specialists who had used the Corres method to save lives in conflicts worldwide. Each successful application validated her belief that understanding enemy psychology was as important as explosive engineering for protecting American forces. The Helmand Province minefield became a case study in how individual expertise could solve tactical problems, defeating elite units when conventional approaches proved inadequate. Valeria understood her success depended not just on technical knowledge, but willingness to take the first step when everyone else recognized it as potentially suicidal. Some problems could only be solved by people willing to do what appeared impossible. Sometimes salvation required understanding that the path through hell was shorter than the path around it. Valeria Corres had taken the first step into a kill zone and shown others how to follow safely. That step would echo through military training for decades, teaching future EOD specialists that sometimes the most dangerous path was actually the way home. Her legacy would be measured not in awards, but in lives saved by specialists who learned to think like enemies and find safe passage through landscapes designed to kill them. The Bronze Star represented more than individual courage. It proved that expertise properly applied with precision and courage could overcome obstacles conventional wisdom declared insurmountable. Some warriors charged through barriers, others walked through carefully, understanding that knowledge and patience could defeat sophisticated engineering and psychology. The kill zone that stopped SEAL Team 7 became testament to individual expertise applied when conventional solutions proved inadequate and unconventional thinking provided the only path to success. Her methods would be studied and refined by military analysts, incorporated into training programs that prepared future generations of EOD specialists for challenges that hadn't been anticipated by traditional military doctrine. The minefield crossing would be remembered as a turning point in how American forces approached the problem of operating in terrain defended by sophisticated explosive obstacles, proving that individual expertise could overcome seemingly impossible challenges when applied with courage and precision. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this.